So I had one of my viewers ask me about the history of source control, and there was some tweets on X, I guess is now it's called, that made me kind of think about this a bit more because I remember back in the day when we didn't have source control. It was proprietary and we didn't have a license. So we had to make up our own system. Nowadays, you have something called a distributed version control system. Uh, that's usually Git in this case. Git was amazing. It was revolutionary for its time, and there's a reason that it exists. It was actually originally used for Linux kernel development because Linux Torvalds got fed up with the proprietary versions of it. And so as a result of that, everybody has Git now. Everybody's standard on Git, and you're kind of a Git if you don't use it. And so the end result is that you should understand and learn Git if you are a software development engineer. It doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter how new you are, it doesn't matter what your experience level, you need to learn Git. And if you do not understand Git, you are behind. It is that simple. But some of you may remember this, like I do. You may remember Subversion. Okay? Subversion was effectively the best version of source control for its time, mostly during the 90s. And, it's going to be end of life soon. This version, they're still doing releases. Obviously, they're doing an end of life of that version, but it's still chugging along. But it doesn't have the power that it used to in the late 90s or early 2000s. And there was also a lot of extensions for Windows, like the Tortoise Shell extensions that allowed you to just right click and actually use it with your operating system in a more graphical way. That was what I remember using it for the most. In fact, if I had a Windows system, I had Subversion installed and I had the ability to right click my folder and open and view the tools and whatnot. And so the fun thing about this is that you don't have that nowadays. It's still very good to learn, but most people don't use it. And so one of the big distinctions about Subversion is that every version has a number and it was just an incrementing number. With Git, you have file hashes and it's all part of a Merkle tree. But with Subversion, it was always about the incrementing number. And if you didn't have the newest number, then you didn't have the newest code. And so before that, though, the thing that created Subversion, the need for it, was the concurrent version system. Now, this obviously isn't part of the GNU project, but the nice thing about this is that this kind of lets you know that this was registered back in 2005, so it's pretty old. But what you have to understand is that this was, kind of like 80s technology, like late 80s, early 90s. And so the big issue there is that the initial versions are proprietary. You didn't have a copy, you couldn't do it. And so you had to use, like for example, GNU's revision control system, which is uh, was early 80s, just kind of replaced that. And so the end result is that you had other options, but they weren't very well formed. And so you would end up using, a source code, the original source code control system back in the day. If you, and that was 1973, okay? But then again, that was proprietary. It was Bell Labs. And so the end result is, there's an open source version of it. But what we used to do back in the day is we would have these giant cathode ray tube monitors, okay? And we would have a CRT for our computer monitor, okay? Now, you see this right here, this little shelf here on top? We would have all of our people in the same room, and we would have a shelf off in the corner somewhere, and it would have an array of stuffed animals representing different parts of the code base. And if you saw that action figure, stuffed animal, whatever you wanted to use on somebody's monitor, that meant they were checking out that code from the file store and they were editing it. That was how we did things back then. Because we didn't have the fancy versioning systems that we do now. And so you would come in, and if you came in early enough, you'd find that nobody had anything on their monitor, which means you could pick the code you could work on for that day. And you could actually get there before the guy that, wanted to work on it that you knew maybe wouldn't work on it as well as you did. This caused a lot of fights on teams. But there was also an implicit agreement, first come, first served. And the idea there was that you could check it out for a day. There was a gentleman's agreement, a gentleperson's agreement, because we did have females on our staff, of course. But the idea was that no matter who was on the team, if somebody had the totem on their monitor, and that's what we called them, totems, whether it was a stuffed animal, a plushie, an action figure, or even a specific book, like it didn't really matter. We just needed an item. It was item-driven version control. You'd put them on the CRT. That was what we had checked out. We'd go check that out, go take the item, put it on our CRT. At that point, we would have the freedom to go check out that code and not edit it or whatever. And if somebody needed to edit something that touched that code, they would look up from their monitor, look around the room, because we would be in the same room, and they would see which one was which. Okay, who has the action figure checked out? I don't see it in anybody's monitor. Is it over on the shelf? Yes. I'm gonna go pull that. Hey Dave, why do you have 3 action figures on your CRT? Well, I'm dealing with some hairy code and it's not written well and it's not very dry. And so as a result of that, I have to refactor that code. Oh, okay. And so that's what would happen. And so all these really early initiatives to keep code separate and keep code from being, keep them being reusable, kind of stemmed from this, because you would block the entire team because you didn't have source control. But now that we have source control, you have to deal with merge conflicts and a bunch of other issues. And so you've kicked the problem down the path a bit, but we also have more flexibility now. The important thing to understand is that version control is critically important. We can go back from, Git, which is distributed, and all these other versions of control, like this is centralized. Subversion is centralized. CVS is centralized. RCS is centralized. And so, CSSC is centralized. And so the end result is that the real big thing that really hit everybody in terms of distributed systems was Git. Because Perforce and Mercury existed, but they weren't so well used. They were mostly used in enterprise environments that could afford the fees, and they were mostly sold to those companies as the cure for the pain of a centralized code repository, which was created by things like Subversion. And so the end result of this is that you need to think about how this path was walked to fully understand why these choices were made and why you do things that you do now in the future. Because there are very good reasons for it, and a lot of them are still valid. It's not just some form of peer pressure from the dead. Okay, it's not just tradition. It's not just peer pressure from dead people. There are engineering reasons for the things that we do. And so every time somebody tells me, "What? We don't need to use source control," I know they're a junior developer or they're just trolling, because I've lived all of this my life. Think about that.